It's a great honor for me to be here to address you today as this 148th year of your great institution convenes. I'm coming from a much older institution to give advice to the young upstart. We're 2 years older at MIT than you are. I'm also very pleased to note that the framework, the things I want to share with you today, are very, very consistent with the vision your rector has just laid out, and indeed with much of the context in the Lombardy region that President Formigoni has referred to. But I want to start with a very simple point. We all share our world. These are words that we have used for many decades, but they're beginning to have a much deeper, a more profound reality today than at any time in the past. We share a fragile environment across all nations and regions of the world. We share a limited base of natural resources. We share many great challenges going forward. I'll say a bit more about that no city, no university, no nation can meet by themselves. We are very fortunate, particularly those of us who are privileged to live our lives in universities, to know how profoundly we share the same knowledge base around the world. But above all, we have a shared humanity that I hope we increasingly can recognize. But what is changing, of course, is that our world is not only shared, but it is increasingly networked, primarily through digital communications, but also in many other ways. And this global networking has occurred with historically astonishing speed, and it means very much for our future. In such a world, I believe that each of us, as universities, as cities, as nations, as companies, we must compete with each other. It's competition that drives excellence. But because of this networking, because of our shared humanity and especially our shared challenges, we must also, at the same time, cooperate with each other. So in many ways, I believe that competing and cooperating are sort of the yin and yang, if you will, of the modern world. And we're going to see a continual rebalancing of this competition and working together. Now, of course, the dominant theme of our times is what the columnist and TV personality and scholar Faraz Zakaria calls the rise of the rest. Most of us grew up and learned and have pursued our careers in a time in which so many ways the world was dominated by what happened in Europe and in North America. But the story today, of course, is the rise of the rest, the economies that are growing with incredible rapidity around the world. And I think that story is told very simply in this graph from the World Bank, which shows the average annual growth of gross domestic product per capita from 1960 through 2000 for a 40-year period. And you will see that the OECD countries that I've colored in dark blue here have grown at about 2.5% over this period. But look at Northeast Asia, and indeed look at Southeast and Pacific Asia. And you see a very different picture beginning to emerge, because it does not take many decades with growth rates like this until you see phenomena such as China now having the second largest economy in the world. And indeed, China and Asia even more broadly is transforming itself very rapidly from the Confucian era into something very modern, and certainly is in fact leading the world in most dimensions in so-called green technologies today. And similarly, India is changing from the view that most of us in the West have of India, certainly typified by the fantastically beautiful Taj Mahal, to something very cutting edge and modern. This is just a little snapshot I happened to take of a couple of buildings on the campus of Infosys, which is the technology-based IT services company that has very much transformed India's leadership in industry into the modern era. So things are changing everywhere. And because of this convocation of the Politecnico, I will emphasize matters having to do with research, development, science, engineering, technology. And again, a very simple way of seeing how rapidly the world is changing is to ask, how is the investment in research and development distributed around the world today? And very simply, the total investment in R&D by both industry and governments is about a third in North America, about a third in Europe, and about a third in Asia. Just a few decades ago, this map would have looked nothing like this. You would have seen a huge dominance in North America and followed by a very strong second across Europe and a very tiny amount in Asia. So the investments that are going to lead to new knowledge are distributed very evenly around the world today. Now, this is a very complicated slide. I don't intend for you to follow it in great detail, but it is just comparing some of the input and output measures in terms of science and technology for 6 countries: Brazil, China, India, Japan, the Russian Federation, and Singapore. And these again are normalized. That is, most things are per dollar or per population. But what I want you to see is that the outer edge of this, and of course the farther out you are, the stronger you are, is virtually defined by one country, Singapore. And you will see that other countries are distorted. They're strong in some areas, they're weaker in others. But again, this is a diagram that is changing very dramatically on the time scale of mere decades. So new knowledge is going to be generated around the world because of a more widely distributed investment in research and development, but also the knowledge workforce for the 21st century is going to be distributed very, very differently than it has been during most of our professional lifetimes. And here's just a little glimpse at this. I've taken the young professional workforce, which is defined here as college graduates who have been out in the workforce for 7 years or less, in 3 countries and 3 fields. The countries, China, India, and the US, and the fields, engineering, life sciences, and sort of broadly defined finance and accounting. And if you look at this, you will see that India, to some extent because of the phenomenon of companies such as Infosys, totally dominates in terms of absolute numbers of young professional workforce in finance, accounting, etc. In engineering, not surprisingly, China is vastly greater in terms of its number of young engineers in the workforce than either India or the United States. And in terms of life sciences, we're somewhat balanced, with the U.S. Maintaining a little bit of lead in that direction. But when you think about the modern knowledge-based economies and the whole role of innovation, there is no question that engineers are an absolutely essential key. Some even define venture capital as the search for good engineers. So we need to see how is that changing. And over a long period of time here, from the early 1980s almost up to the present, you will see that the US has actually declined in a very non-trivial amount, declined in the number of engineers it graduates each year at the bachelor's level. Japan has rather strongly outstripped the United States in terms of the number of engineers graduated each year. And South Korea, starting from a very little base, has now gotten to the point that it graduates as many engineers as the US, and they are very competent. And the UK, you can see there. And I didn't want to put too many countries because it would get too busy. But you might ask, so if that's what's going on in these countries, what's happening in China? And this is what is happening in China. And yes, there is a broad spectrum of quality. Some of the many newer universities that are forming are not as good as the top few, but that will all change with time. And of course you should say, well, that's not surprising. China has 1.3 billion people. They're coming up the economic ladder. They've got an infrastructure to build out, and so they're going to need all of those engineers. But nonetheless, when you think about the role of engineering in innovation and the creation of new industries, this is a very, very significant change. And India, in different ways, is moving up as well. I actually don't have numbers that I trust for the graduation rates in India, but this is simply the number of engineering schools in India. And again, yes, there's a broad quality difference, but they too will progress very rapidly. So the distribution of investment in creating new knowledge, the distribution in creating new workforce is changing rather dramatically. Now, I like to formulate things in the following way. Over the past 20, 30, 50 years, we've talked a lot about brain drain. And what this mostly means is that brilliant young women and men have moved from the poorer countries in the world to universities and then ultimately to industry, especially in the United States and certainly in Western Europe as well. And the term brain drain has a negative connotation. It means that we are building our expertise in Europe and the US to in some extent to the detriment of the countries of origin of many of these bright people. But I think we've moved now, and I heard it very much in the rector's comments, to a different era, which is dominated by what I like to call brain circulation. Young people especially are simply moving around the world now. Now, in the big multinational corporations, this has been the reality for 30, 40 years. It's nothing new. But in the world of universities, the world of small companies and so forth, I think we're moving to a very different era in which people will move around and spend major parts of their career in different parts of the world. And we can no longer just view this as a one-way street. But I think what will come next is what I call brain integration. And what that means is that we're not going to have to necessarily circulate physically, but we're also going to use the networking of the world to solve problems together, to innovate together, to construct and design together. And just to give you a little idea of what I mean by this and why I think it's quite different than what is going on today, and I won't spend a lot of time, this is kind of a complicated subject, but this talks about the work of a young faculty member, David Baker, at the University of Washington in the United States. He works in biomedical engineering and biology on very complicated problems some of you know about that are called, that have to do with the way in which hugely complex molecules, proteins, fold and orient themselves. And it's a very, very computationally intensive problem to work on. So David started off doing what many faculty do in this kind of problem. They chain together hundreds of computers around the world, and people volunteer their laptop, their desktop computer to connect together to solve these complicated problems. And one day he thought to himself, what if I could link all these brains together, not just computers? And so he created, thinking of how he wanted young people engaged, he created a computer game. And this computer game is played by thousands of people around the world. Some of them don't even know what it's doing. But the point is, in competing to try to win this game, they are actually jointly thinking through the thermodynamics of the folding of this molecule and coming up with the ultimate solution, which is shown as this little blue dot here. But again, the details are not important. The point is linking minds and computers together, solving a problem. For the most part, here, kids just having fun playing a computer game. And back at my institution, MIT, a group of faculty from all across the institute have recently formed something called the Center for Collective Intelligence. And the core question they are attempting to answer is just this: how can people and computers be connected so that together they can act more intelligently than any person, any group, or any computer has ever done before? And this is not the only example of this kind of a research group, but I think that these highly interdisciplinary teams thinking through this fundamental problem will help us find new ways to meet our challenges. Now, at the core of all of this are research universities such as the Politecnico di Milano. And I'm going to take a very simple view of research universities and their processes and products. Our most important process is very simple. It's something we all call learning. And in research universities, we learn in many different ways. Obviously, we transmit knowledge. We have the human activity of teaching the next generation. We involve research. In a great research university, research and teaching are just two parts of the fundamental idea of learning, but increasingly we also provide experiences, experiential learning to our students through traveling to other countries, through working in industry, and so forth. So together, these form our most important process, without which we would not exist, which is the learning of young men and women. But I take a slightly different view than many people on what our product is, because most people will say our product is knowledge. I believe our primary product is opportunity. I believe research universities exist to provide and create opportunity. Obviously, opportunity for our graduates through their education to help make them more productive citizens of their nation and of the world, to enable them and empower them to be able to do jobs, particularly in the knowledge age. And also, we hope that we don't forget simply inculcating the life of the mind into our graduates provides a wealth of personal opportunity. But we also create opportunity through our research, in particular for business and industry. We provide employees, obviously, but we also increasingly are a source of new ideas for industry, for companies both large and small, and in fact, through technology transfer, play an increasingly important, not dominant, but increasingly important role in the design and development of new products and services at early stages. But we also create a flow of people and of ideas to nations, to regions, to states, to cities, and so forth, to help build their economies and don't ever forget this, to help build a fine quality of life. So opportunity through education, research, and the flow of people and ideas. And opportunity and learning increasingly come together to help create this term that is used far too frequently these days, but is very important: innovation. Doing new things in new ways, and also, by the way, doing old things in new ways. And we as universities are part of an innovation system. And it's a very complicated flow, actually, of people and ideas and money. Now, in the university world, we usually just look at this part of things and say, well, the government provides us money, we provide ideas, and even more importantly, we provide educated people. But in the so-called innovation system, the way in which we take bright people, new knowledge, new technologies, and create new products, services, businesses, and move them into the marketplace is far more complicated still, involving big companies, involving investors in the stock market, involving small startups, and so forth. And I don't want to spend a lot of time with this, but just to recognize that the way in which innovation is created in most of the world, universities play a very important and sometimes misunderstood role, but it is a very complex system in which we must all work together. But the reason I bring this up is that innovation is no longer sort of a closed local circuit. It's very open, it's very global. One of the big trends today in the world of business and business scholarship was really started, a term that was coined by Harry Chesbrough, who was at Harvard at the time, now at Berkeley in the US, the term open innovation, which means, again, this competition cooperation that I talked about earlier, and businesses today, particularly large ones, get their ideas not just from inside, but from outside, frequently even from competitors. And they're beginning to have this flow of ideas and new ideas, and innovation is a very open activity now and spans the globe. So what about universities? Are we globalizing? Business globalized long ago, although it's a path they continue to move down. What about our research universities? I think we've globalized in two phases. Universities as we know it, of course, were created in this part of the world, and especially here in Italy. But in the more modern era, Germany, and Humboldt University in particular, really became the original model for research universities, combining graduate level research with teaching and learning and education more broadly. That model was moved to the United States, specifically to the Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, and over a century that began to be changed and adapted and moved forward through our great public institutions like Berkeley and Michigan and the University of California, and also our great private universities, Stanford being a great exemplar, and then there's somewhat more focused institutions such as MIT, Caltech, Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, and so forth. And that created the modern research university. And in the early decades of this century, there's been a very interesting flow of these ideas and concepts back to the mother lode, if you will, back to Germany. And I could tell you some funny stories about that, but we don't have time. But things have been going on, of course, in different parts of the world in addition. In the 1960s, the establishment of the Indian Institutes of Technology across India, I believe, is one of the really great success stories of higher education in the 20th century. And we now, in this new century, are seeing an incredible acceleration of research universities across Asia and now beginning in the Middle East. And of course, there was a lot of reframing and thinking here in Europe through the Bologna process and so forth. But the part I want to talk about today is something different. It's not unrelated, but it's different. It's sort of a second phase in which it's not just moving a concept around and adapting it. It's really an openness and a cooperation worldwide. Universities today are doing lots of things. They're creating physical presences in other countries, building campuses, establishing laboratories beyond their own country. There are many strategic alliances being built. But what I think is really even more interesting is the virtual presence of institutions in other countries through so-called distance education, not a term I particularly like, but it's used quite commonly. both synchronous, that is, sitting in a classroom in country A and country B, communicating by video teleconference at the same time, or asynchronous, by putting things out on the web in one country that's used in other countries. And I'm particularly interested in this last part, the open content movement and the emergence of what I like to call the meta-university. This is the movement, the availability of teaching materials, libraries, scholarly archives, and even the ability to operate laboratories from a distance that is made possible by the IT networking of the world. So while I had the great privilege of serving as president at MIT, I became very passionate about what sharing of knowledge should mean in the modern era. Because, as I said, the role of universities is to cooperate opportunity, and we know that people everywhere are smart and capable, and if we can just help them, we can build opportunity for people far beyond our own boundaries. And one contribution that we at MIT made to this is we had this quite bold and radical idea. We put the teaching materials for all 2,000 subjects that we teach at MIT on the World Wide Web and simply made them available for anyone, anywhere, anytime to use with no financial charge and to adapt and utilize in whatever way they saw fit. And we also learned very quickly that many people sought this knowledge. This graph just simply shows the early growth of the use of MIT's open courseware materials from the World Wide Web. The light blue at the bottom is the original courses, the materials put out in English. Those above it are translations that are occurring around the world into other languages of this material. And you can see that OpenCourseWare is being used all over the world, less than half across the United States and Canada, and about 20% across Europe, broadly defined, about 20% across Asia, and even beginning to make a little bit of penetration into Africa. But the most important thing I want to show you about this is that it really did help begin a movement. MIT, as you can see from this graph, is now only about 25% of the serious OpenCourseWare movement. And what I mean by the serious OpenCourseWare movement is institutions that have committed a very high quality of production and quality monitoring and ability to search and so forth and so on, similar to MIT's. And so just as we hoped would happen, it has begun to build into a worldwide movement. And there are many other examples. If we had time today, we could talk about the online presence for zero or at least small cost of libraries, scholarly materials of all sorts, actual online education in the form of videoed lectures and so forth, and as I said earlier, even a few web-accessible laboratories, such as the one we run at MIT, where we actually have students sitting with laptops in sub-Saharan Africa, literally operating, not simulating, but operating laboratory equipment back in Cambridge or in some of the companies around the world that cooperate with this. So what I think this is all about is openness, not just sharing of resources, but pointing out the importance of openness in higher education. This, I believe, is the true spirit of education, democratization, and empowerment of people everywhere. It underpins 21st century innovation, it underpins cooperation and competition in some sense worldwide. It enables sharing and accessing of expensive and intellectually intensive materials. And that maybe should be highlighted even more. This is a way of gaining efficiency, of getting more use around the world of things that have been developed at great expense and time and intellect in one region and sharing it. And if we can begin to build that, we build a different sort of worldwide network. And it certainly speaks of institutional and national values. Now, the open flow of scientific information is age-old and it's essential. We all know that true science, discovery science, thrives only through unfettered communication. Science has had an international culture for centuries, and it requires criticism, testing, and repetition. So this openness is very traditional in pure science. But the flow of open resources for education is something that is just now beginning to develop in the sense that I bring it forward. It's not new. We've shared materials for years through books and journals, but the internet and the web introduce unprecedented scope, reach, speed, and interaction. So I think something much more fundamental is happening. I personally believe that we're starting to form something I call the meta-university, that it's beginning to emerge, that it's a transcendent, accessible, empowering, dynamic, communally constructed framework of open materials and platforms on which much of higher education in the world is being either constructed or made better. And what's interesting about this to me is that I do not believe it's going to replace residential campuses, experiences such as people get here at the Politecnico, but it will enable them, it will strengthen them. It will bring cost efficiencies to institutions by sharing of development. It will be adaptive, not prescriptive. In the modern world, that's very important. When we put course materials from MIT out, you use what part of it you want, you throw away that part you don't want, you adapt whatever you want, add to it, subtract from it. It's not something that comes down from on high and says this is the way to do it. That adaptability is very important. It serves both teachers and learners. It will speed the propagation of education and experience and scholarship, build capacity for economic development, build bridges across political boundaries, across cultures, and will have a particular importance in the developing world. Now, as I move toward the conclusion of what I wanted to say to you today, I want to point out again that all of our grand challenges we face, they don't just have to do with Italy, they don't just have to do with the United States or with Africa or with China, they affect us all. And the things we are going to spend the next decades of our careers and what the young women and men will be working on are making the earth sustainable, increasing our security and resilience, not just against man-made threats, but against natural threats, improving health everywhere, and hopefully, literally, improving the joy of living. At the U.S. National Academy of Engineering, about 5 years ago now, we launched a project called Grand Challenges for Engineering to inspire, challenge, and educate the next generation. And we did what we always do. We brought a fabulous committee together of people who were true innovators themselves to think about what are we going to face in this new century that has engineering in particular at the core of solving and meeting. It was headed by Bill Perry, former Secretary of Defense, now Stanford professor. It was global, diverse. I'm not going to go through all these names, but some terrifically interesting people here. Bob Langer, one of the world's great bioengineers. You see Larry Page, one of the founders of Google. Mario Molina, who shared the Nobel Prize for understanding the role of CFCs in the ozone layer. Craig Venter, leader in the sequencing of the human genome and now the development of the new world of synthetic biology. Jane Lubchenco, who heads the National Atmospheric and Oceanic Administration in the Obama administration. So all really highly accomplished men and women. And they came up with these 14 challenges. And I'm not going to take your time to go through them, but they all fit these 4 boxes I had earlier of having to do with sustainability, with health, and with security writ large, and with joy of living. And you can go to our website and learn quite a bit about this. It's highly interactive. But the point here is to meet these great challenges of providing health and food and water and security around the world, people are going to have to learn, share ideas, and innovate. And we're going to have to do these things together. The day of being able to meet them in one location is gone, although we all contribute, people and ideas, learning and innovation, all working together in this new networked world. And I think in closing, I want to point out that as we do this, just as we have to begin rebalancing competition and cooperation, we also have to do two other things that I thought were very central to what your new rector had to say and also to what your president had to say. And that is that simultaneously, institutions like this have to be locally relevant. They have to be engaged in the economy, in the business, in the cultural and social life of the location in which they find themselves, but simultaneously, and it's the nice thing about this new century, simultaneously they must be part of this great global network and for innovation and for learning and sharing of knowledge. So being locally relevant and also being part of what's going on in this new networked world. And so with that, I want to thank you very much for this privilege of addressing you today and wish you well in your next 148 years and beyond. Thank you very much.